Welcome to Recurring Insight. It's the beginning of your upkeep, so it's time for another episode. I'm your host, Michael, and let's dive in. This week, we're going over Sans Blue Stax decks. We're going to compare and contrast Winota by Comedian, Marath by KumaTheBear, and Metapod by Infiniteimoc, Twice, and Lerker. Winota looks to leverage Winota's ability to snowball into Stax pieces before comboing out. The current iteration is geared towards the current ad nos meta. Marath uses Stax pieces and Marath to control the board before locking people out or comboing off. It can run a higher density of combos due to Marath being an infinite mana outlet. It's best in a dork heavy meta or a meta with low toughness commanders, although it does have a number of Stax pieces for the uphill battle that is the Turbo Nos meta. Metapod is considered a tempo deck. It slows opponents with Stax pieces while using Tymna to generate advantage before finishing them off. It's not trying to grind the game out longer than necessary, it's trying to land a couple of hard-hitting pieces before leveraging that into a win. The current iteration is a middle ground approach that isn't overly focused on attacking a certain type of deck. It's built to play in a mixed meta, but it does well in mid-range metas and most others, besides Turbo Nos metas, as it doesn't have blue stack interaction. It's important to note the meta these decks are built to play in, as Stax decks are meta dependent. Alright, let's take a look at the combos each of them run. They all run the Kiki Jiki combo, although there are some variations. Winota is the only one that runs Combat Celebrant and Zealous Conscripts, as her ability can put humans onto the battlefield. That being said, although Zealous Conscripts is more expensive, it can also borrow any permanent. Because Winota doesn't have access to Birthing Pod, and Felidar Guardian is a relatively expensive non-human that can't be cheated out, there's not much incentive for her to run it. Winota and Metapod also run Splinter Twin, which serves as a replacement for Kiki Jiki, comboing with all of the aforementioned pieces besides Felidar Guardian. Felidar Guardian and Splinter Twin can only make infinite tapped guardians that are sacked on the end step, so you'd need some sort of payoff. Marath, as an infinite mana outlet, can afford not to run Splinter Twin. Goblin Sharpshooter has the added benefit of allowing a second main phase Kiki Jiki combo. When the copies are sacrificed, the death triggers go on the stack, so you can use Sharpshooter to ping your opponents in between the triggers. Winota was originally running it, but cut it due to the diminished number of mana dorks in the current ad nos meta, as well as the lack of synergy with the typical game plan. Marath runs Emiel the Blessed, which goes infinite with Dockside or Village Bellringer, as long as you get at least 4 mana from the ETBs. For Village Bellringer, you do need to be able to generate infinite mana in Naya colors in order to win with Marath. The name of the Marath list is Marath Holy Trinity for a reason. The Holy Trinity of Stax pieces refer to Collect Oof, Cursed Totem, and Living Plane. This locks your opponents out of activating abilities, including mana abilities. However, because Cursed Totem shuts down Marath, it runs Linvala instead. It also runs Null Rod and Stony Silence as redundant oof effects. There are cards that get around this lock, like Carpet of Flowers and free spells, but for the most part, this shuts your opponents out entirely. If you've got Unbound Flourishing, Earthcraft, and a basic land, you can create infinite 1/1 elementals using Marath. With everything on the field, pay 1 mana into Marath to create a 1/1 elemental, and Unbound Flourishing copies the ability. Use Earthcraft to tap one of the elementals to untap the basic land, and then use the mana to activate Marath, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it. You can then use the final untapped creature to untap the basic land, putting you back at the start, except you've got 2 tapped elementals. That being said, you do have to wait to untap before you can swing in for the win. If you've got Utopia Sprawl or Wild Growth on the basic land, you can use this to generate infinite mana and go for the win. If you've got Earthcraft and both Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth on basic lands, you can use a similar loop to generate infinite mana as long as the enchanted basic lands can tap for white, green, and red. Finally, if you've got Cryptic Trilobite and a counter doubler like Conclave Mentor on the field, you have unbounded Marath activations. Starting with Conclave Mentor and Marath on the field, cast Cryptic Trilobite for X=1, then pay 1 and tap it to add 2 counters. Remove a counter for 2 mana, then put 1 of the mana into Marath to put 2 +1/+1 counters on itself, and use the final floating mana to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Cryptic Trilobite. Repeat this until both are infinitely large before removing enough counters from Cryptic Trilobite to ping everyone with Marath. Now that we've covered that, let's look at the removal. there's a lot of variation despite the overlapping colors. As mentioned before, Metapod runs Goblin Sharpshooter for Splinter Twin, but Sharpshooter has enough utility that Marath runs it despite not including Splinter Twin. It can absolutely hose Dork decks. Both Marath and Winota run Skyclave Apparition and Swords to Plowshares. Swords is cheap removal for lower color decks, and Apparition hits most permanents that you care about. It also triggers Winota, which is a bonus. Those are all the removal spells Marath runs, as Marath is removal in the command zone. Winota runs more, as it cares about attacking, and there's been a rise in powerful permanents. Abrade is versatile, and Crater Maker and Mog Fanatic trigger Winota. Additionally, Mog Fanatic is part of the Conspicuous Snoop combo line. Path to Exile is more cheap removal, although it does ramp your opponents, which explains its exclusion from the other decks. Shatterskull has a low opportunity cost, as you can just use it as a land. Having access to black and green greatly improves the removal package for Metapod. Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy are top tier removal spells, and Fire Covenant is a one-sided board wipe. Force of Vigor makes the cut over Nature's Claim because it is a higher ceiling, and the majority of cards in Metapod are green, so it's easy to pay for the alternate cost. Both Metapod and Winota prize versatility in their interaction, which explains some of the exclusions. Although they all lack blue, they make the best of what they have when it comes to stack interaction. They all run red and white, hence the cards they have in common. They all care about having their commander on the field, so deflecting swap makes sense, even with Winota being 4 CMC. Pyroblast, Red Elemental Blast, and Silence are auto-includes. Winota really cares about keeping the commander on the field, hence Alseid of Life's Bounty and Giver of Runes. Additionally, they both trigger Winota. So does Hope of Jirapur, which is a worse Silence, and Order of the Sacred Torch. Order can hit a lot of high-value spells, like Tutors and Ad Nauseam. Ranger Captain of Eos serves as another silence effect, with a bonus of getting another creature to trigger Winota. Tybalt's Trickery, despite its downside, is a universal counter for non-blue decks, and makes it into Winota and Marath. It's still being considered for inclusion in Metapod, but at 2 mana it is expensive. The deck can't afford to hold up 2 mana in the early game, and in the late game, it needs to close the game out rather than extending it, and it already has some pieces to protect the combo. However, both Winota and Marath are running Drannith Magistrate and Rule of Law effects, which negate the downsides. Metapod runs Destiny Spinner, as the majority of the stacks is creature and enchantment based, and so are the combos. Metapod also runs Vexing Shusher, which can protect your own pieces or back up someone in a counter war. They don't make it into Marath, as most of the stack's pieces are creatures, and thus dodge most counter spells. Additionally, as Marath doesn't have a card advantage engine in the command zone, it's more important for it to be able to draw gas and risk it being countered and draw protection without any gas. Both Metapod and Marath have access to Veil of Summer. Alright, onto the stacks, which is going to be the largest section. They do have a lot in common. Arcan is a Rule of Law effect with one-sided non-basic land hate. Aven Mind Sensor hits Tutors, which is brutal. Deafening Silence is, considering the reliance on creature-based stacks, often one-sided. Drannith Magistrate cuts people off from their commanders, which always hurts. Magus of the Moon makes it in even the 4-color Metapod. It's interesting that Blood Moon doesn't make it into the decks, which can, in part, be attributed to Dockside and the power of Turbo Naz decks. Artifacts are the preferred form of ramp for Turbo Naz decks, and they can fix mana bases to the point that it's only worth running 1 moon effect. Winota prefers Magus as it can be cheated into play and needs most of its stacks pieces to be creatures, while Magus can swing in for Tymna damage. Similar to Deafening Silence, Thalia can really punish decks that aren't as reliant on creatures. Winota and Marath run 3 more Rule of Law effects, including the OG, that don't make it into Metapod due to the other options granted by having more colors. Additionally, Aethersworn Canonist still allows opponents to dump rocks. Speaking of which, having green gives Marath and Metapod access to Collector Oof. Linvala makes it into both of them as well, but is excluded from Winota due to being a high CMC non-human creature. They also run Nullrod, Rest in Peace, and Trinisphere. Nullrod doesn't make it into Winota, as Winota relies on artifacts for ramp. Although it does shut off pod, it typically hurts opponents enough to make up for it. Rest in Peace isn't as niche as it used to be, as it stops breach, and even after it's removed, it'll take a bit to refill their graveyard. Again, it does hurt pod lines, but it's worth it. Trinisphere can be brutal, especially if it comes down early, but Winota does try to limit the amount of non-creature based Stax pieces. From here on out, each Stax piece is included in only one of the decks. Starting with Winota, it's got 3 tax effects. Almost half the deck is creatures, so these are more or less one-sided, in addition to their synergy with Winota. Grand Abolisher is incredible, and with Winota's ability, it can be put onto the battlefield without a chance for opponents to respond. Phyrexian Revoker is more narrow, but it can typically find a decent target. Remorseful Cleric can stop Breach, and Sanctum Prelate stops non-creature spells of a specific CMC. Considering how low to the ground cEDH is, that can stop a good chunk of interaction. Like Grand Abolisher, it can be cheated into play without opponents having a chance to respond. Spirit of the Labyrinth is brutal, and although it is universal, Winota's ability means she can accrue card advantage without drawing cards. Some of the pieces are suboptimal, not bad, but not the best of their kind. However, Winota does have the most limited options of the 3 decks. Additionally, they make up for it by either triggering Winota or being able to be cheated into play by Winota. Marath runs Stony Silence and Hushbringer. Stony Silence invests more heavily into attacking artifact decks, which, with Dockside and Breach, are very prevalent. Hushbringer hits ETBs and death triggers, the most notable of which are Thoracle and Dockside. And we're on to Metapod, which has access to the most pieces. Aura of Silence is stacks and removal in 1 card. Chalice of the Void is flexible, but it will typically come down as 0, which shuts off fast mana and therefore most Breach combos. In addition to Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void is one-sided Grave Hate. This means you can still perform pod lines with it on the field. Mayhem Devil hits Dockside and Breach combos, and allows the Kiki-Jiki combo to go through after combat. When all of the copies are sacrificed, you get a Mayhem Devil trigger for each copy. Opposition Agent is, well, Opposition Agent. That seems like enough justification. Root Maze is brutal in the first few turns, and even later in the game can shut off some combos. Sire of Insanity can be game-ending, and Tymna can break parity on it. That being said, there are some decks that are better positioned to take advantage of Sire, so it shouldn't be used indiscriminately. Stranglehold shuts off your opponent's tutors, and Tanglewire breaks parity with itself. Although neither of them are backbreaking, they're great at backing up other Stax pieces. The card draw on the decks is very lacking, but they have a preference for engines rather than one-shot spells. Winota doesn't run any card draw spells, as the commander itself is a card advantage engine, and Boros really doesn't have access to too many good draw spells. Both green decks run Sylvan Library for obvious reasons. Marath, being slightly more invested in creatures than Metapod, runs Frostfang and Toski to take advantage of them, while Runic Armasaur lets one draw off fetches and non-mana activated abilities of opponents. It's excluded from Metapod because in testing, it was found that the type of meta it would thrive in was either uncommon or they just played around it. Additionally, it has a card draw engine in the command zone, so it can afford running one less. It runs Dark Confidant and Occam Adversary, both of which provide consistent draw for little investment and can trigger Tymna. I do want to note the lack of wheel effects. They can refuel opponents' hands when you're close to locking the board down, and Dork decks can't dump their hands as quickly as other decks. To make up for the lack of card draw, they run a sizable amount of tutors. In Stax decks, it's better to be more reliant on tutors than card draw to make sure they can hit the right pieces at the right time. The only tutor they all have in common is Enlightened Tutor for obvious reasons. The 2 green decks both take advantage of the additional creature tutors they have access to. Pod can be used to assemble the Kiki-Jiki combo, starting with a 3 CMC creature on the field. Since both decks run Archon, I'll use it for this example. For Pod, cast it, activate it to find Felidar Guardian, which flickers Pod. Activate Pod again to find Karmic Guide, Reanimating Guardian, which will flicker Pod. Activate Pod again to find Kiki-Jiki, use Kiki-Jiki to make a copy of Karmic Guide, which reanimates Guardian, flickering Kiki-Jiki. Survival of the Fittest can also be used to assemble the combo. Starting with it on the field, discard a creature to find Felidar Guardian, discard Guardian to find Kiki-Jiki, discard Kiki-Jiki to find Karmic Guide, then cast Karmic Guide, reanimating Kiki-Jiki. Activate Kiki-Jiki to create a copy of Karmic Guide, reanimating Guardian, flickering Kiki-Jiki. Due to the cost, it's a bonus that you are able to activate Survival of the Fittest on an opponent's end step. Winota and Marath both run Gamble and Imperial Recruiter. Metapod eschews them as it has access to black tutors. Winota runs Goblin Recruiter as it doesn't have access to Pod or Survival of the Fittest. Goblin Recruiter can be used to assemble the Kiki-Jiki combo. The typical line starts with casting Recruiter, putting Snoop, Torch Courier, and Kiki-Jiki on top of your library. Go to your next turn and draw Snoop. Cast Snoop, then cast Torch Courier off the top of your library, and sacrifice it to give Snoop haste. Activate Kiki-Jiki's ability using Snoop to make a copy of itself that has haste. Repeat this to make unbounded tapped Snoops, then use the last untapped Snoop to copy Recruiter. With Recruiter's ETB, put Mog Fanatic on top of your library. You can then snack the Snoops using Mog Fanatic's ability to ping your opponents. Mog Catcher can be used to put Goblin Recruiter or Kiki-Jiki directly on the battlefield, which is huge as it avoids stack interaction, and Recruiter of the Guard can be used to find them. Ranger Captain of Eos is useful because of its activated ability, but it can find a cheap creature to trigger Winota as a bonus. One note about Mog Catcher is that it's actually a human mercenary, so it can be cheated into play with Winota. Academy Rector makes it into Marath as you can use Marath to ping it. Court of Calling is more expensive, but it's instant speed and has Convoke, so it can leverage the Stax pieces. Crop Rotation can find Gaia's Cradle, and Worldly Tutor is a good tier 2 tutor. Try saying that 10 times fast. Metapod gets access to black and all the tutors that come with it. Not much to say about these. Let's move on to the recursion. Winota doesn't run any, which is fair, as Boros doesn't have access to that much recursion except for Breach. However, it doesn't make the cut as Winota isn't good at fueling it and it doesn't have the colors to break it. The green decks run more. Karmic God, as mentioned previously, can be used in Pod and Survival of the Fittest lines. Eternal Witness makes it into Marath due to the lack of card draw, while having Timna allows Metapod to run Noxious Revival. Then we've got the ramp, which is relatively subdued in Stax decks compared to other archetypes. They all run Dockside Extortionist, Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, and Soul Ring. These are self-explanatory, but I do have one note about Dockside. Even though Marath is running the most artifact hate pieces, Dockside and its combo potential is too powerful to ignore. After this, there's a stark difference between Winota and the decks that have access to green. Starting with Winota, it runs the 2 CMC rocks as it doesn't have access to dorks. Due to the commander's explosive potential, it also runs Chrome Mox, Mana Vault, and some one-shots. There's a lot of overlap between Marath and Metapod. They run the best dorks and enchantments. However, Metapod has access to Deathrite Shaman and Elves of Deep Shadow, while Marath runs Chrome Mox and Utopia Sprawl. It is interesting that Chrome Mox doesn't make it into Metapod, but they chose Gemstone Caverns over Chrome Mox due to Caverns being better later in the game. Finally, we've got the Miscellaneous cards. These are run for their synergy with the commander. Winota runs Emiria's Call as there's a very low opportunity cost. Winota doesn't really leverage their life total for anything, and in 2 colors, it's safe to run. The others, excluding Rick, are non-human creatures that can trigger Winota. Loyal Apprentice is the other exception, and he creates Thopters. Rick buffs your creatures to the point where combat damage becomes a very real threat. Conclave Mentor and Unbound Flourishing have insane synergy with Marath, upping the value get per cast, while Cryptic Trilobite can be used to pay for Marath's ability. They also have combo potential, as mentioned previously. Nightshade Peddler turns Marath pings into instant kills. There's only one in Metapod, which is Loyal Apprentice. It can swing for Timna and creates additional attackers. For both Winota and Metapod, especially Winota, although it may be tempting to play more cards that can create attackers, going too far into the rabbit hole decreases the overall card quality of the deck. Let's take a look at the general overview of the decks. Marath runs the least removal, as its commander is removal on a stick, and Metapod has access to the best removal, so it can afford to run less. Winota is the most explosive commander, so it runs the most stack interaction. The stacks counts are pretty similar, although Marath runs the least due to Marath being able to control the board. The card draw is pretty low, and is made up for in the tutor department, with the exception of Winota. Boros only has so many good tutors, but Winota can provide insane card advantage. This also explains the gap between Marath and Metapod, as Timna is a good source of card draw. The ramp differences are mostly explained by the color identities. The miscellaneous cards indicate how heavily each deck relies on their commanders, and, unsurprisingly, Winota runs the highest density. And that's about it. Credit goes to Comedian, KumaTheBear, Infiniteimoc, Twice, and Lerker for the decks, and Scryfall for the images. If you haven't already, I recommend checking out Comedian's YouTube channel for analytical gameplay. Each deck is linked in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know which was your favorite deck in the comments. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm your host, Michael, and I'll see you at the beginning of the next upkeep for another episode of Recurring Insight.